The notification pinged sharply against the soft jazz playing in the upscale bistro, making Chloe Sinclair flinch as her phone vibrated in her hand. "I want to get back together," the text from Adrian Wells read, blinking insistently on the screen. She froze, the golden light from the chandelier scattering across the polished wood table and catching the edge of her espresso cup, the tiny ripple of liquid reflecting like a warning. 2 tables away, Adrian's lips met another woman's with ease, her laughter threading through the low hum of clinking cutlery, and Chloe felt a physical tightening in her chest as she gripped the chair edge, knuckles whitening. Her gaze shifted to the floor, noticing a speck of dust on the glossy tile, a subtle reminder of the control she could reclaim. She recalled the morning sunlight spilling through her small apartment windows, the way her fingers had traced the rim of her coffee mug as she planned her first solo client pitch, the meticulous notes on her laptop showing months of painstaking rebuilding. A waiter passed by, dropping a spoon with a clang that startled both Chloe and Adrian's date, forcing Adrian to glance briefly in her direction, his eyes flicking away too quickly. Chloe sipped her espresso deliberately, feeling the heat trace a line down her throat, anchoring her attention. She tapped the screen once, leaving the message unread, then set the phone face down on the table. The vibration stopped but the implication remained. Adrian wanted her back, but she sat unmoved, observing. A subtle smirk played across her lips as Adrian brushed a strand of hair from his date's face, Chloe's vision narrowing to the movement, timing it like a predator measuring prey. Flashbacks flickered, a wedding photograph, her hand lingering over the cake knife for a second longer than necessary, a forgotten anniversary dinner where she had stayed silent, swallowing the words that could have saved her dignity. The restaurant's ambient murmur pressed in, servers weaving between tables, the faint scent of roasted coffee beans and fresh bread mingling with the undercurrent of tension. Chloe shifted her weight, crossing one leg over the other, the movement precise, rehearsed, signaling an unspoken assertion of composure. Adrian laughed again, louder this time, the sound cutting through Chloe's micro-adjustments. She picked up her napkin, folded it meticulously, letting the crisp creases mirror the calm she radiated. The moment stretched, seconds elongating as she scanned the menu. Though she didn't intend to order, each deliberate glance a quiet counterpoint to Adrian's overt display, every subtle motion a micro-power shift. A waiter's footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Adrian's date turned to greet him, Chloe's eyes tracking the subtle bend of his elbow, the tilt of his shoulder, small revelations that layered the scene with tension, questions about loyalty, desire, and consequence tightening around her. Chloe exhaled slowly, adjusting her posture, resting one hand against the polished tabletop, feeling the slight chill transmit through her fingers, a tactile reminder that she was present, calculating, and in control. As the evening light deepened, shadows crawling across the floor, she glanced back down at the unread message, the cursor blinking once, twice, each pulse a heartbeat of anticipation and potential. The camera would follow her eyes sweeping the room, settling on Adrian's face, the gap between them charged, unresolved, leaving the audience on the edge of what might happen next. The curiosity gap taut and ready to snap as Chloe prepared for the first move in her silent, strategic reclamation of power. Chloe Sinclair stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor, the sharp sound drawing a few glances from nearby diners, and she did not care as her phone buzzed again with a new message from Adrian. "I need to explain." She slipped the phone into her purse, eyes darting to the vase of tulips in the center of the table, noticing one petal slightly wilted, a small imperfection that mirrored her suspicion. Across the room, Adrian leaned closer to his date, lowering his voice, a detail Chloe caught as the edge of a menu fluttered in his hands, signaling something secretive, something deliberate. She traced the rim of her water glass, watching the condensation drip slowly onto the table, timing her breath, letting the cool touch ground her. Chloe imagined Adrian's words were meant to manipulate, to rewind time, and every laugh he shared with the other woman felt like evidence, though she knew it might be misleading. The waiter dropped a tray of breadsticks, the clatter momentarily silencing conversations, and Chloe saw Adrian startle, a subtle flicker of vulnerability she seized in her mind as confirmation. She reached for her notebook, jotting down brief observations, the scratch of pen on paper masking her tension. The soft lighting caught the glint of her bracelet as she adjusted her sleeve, a minor act of composure asserting control over the scene. Adrian glanced up, noticing Chloe for the first time in minutes, his smile slightly off. A flicker of uncertainty she registered like a map to the next move. Chloe's eyes moved to the wine glass in front of her, swirling the deep red liquid slowly, imagining it as a timer counting down the seconds until she acted, weighing the potential outcomes. The murmur of the room shifted as the jazz saxophone hit a higher note, and she used the sound to mask a subtle shift in her posture, leaning forward just enough to signal readiness without breaking her calm. A waiter passed, refilling a water glass near Adrian, causing a reflection of light to catch Chloe's eye, momentarily blinding her and sparking a quick assumption that he was hiding a message in plain sight. Another layer to decode. She tapped her finger lightly on the tabletop, a rhythmic pattern that mirrored her racing thought process, deciding that a direct confrontation could force a revelation. Chloe picked up her phone, typing a brief, ambiguous reply that could mean anything, testing a reaction, and the vibration against the leather of her purse suggested a shift in the power dynamic, albeit subtle. Adrian shifted in his seat, adjusting his posture as if sensing her gaze, and Chloe noticed the cufflink on his wrist catching the light, a detail that seemed unimportant yet now tied in her mind to prior inconsistencies she had observed. She exhaled, repositioning her hand on the notebook to underline a phrase, the deliberate motion A. Silent challenge, signaling that she was present, aware and ready to act. The ambient hum of conversations rose, punctuated by laughter from a nearby table, and Chloe allowed her eyes to trace Adrian's movements, each glance and tilt of his head forming a puzzle she intended to solve before the night ended. As she shifted her weight slightly, a napkin fluttered to the floor, drawing a startled look from the table next to her and a distracted glance from Adrian, and Chloe's mind leapt to the possibility that he was planning something unseen, a twist in the interaction she had not predicted. Her hand hovered above her purse, fingers brushing the zipper, ready to retrieve the phone again, weighing whether to escalate, observe or wait, and the tension built as she recognized that any move now would ripple outward, shaping the unfolding scene. The saxophone swelled, the polished floors reflected the chandelier light in a shifting pattern, and Chloe adjusted her gaze, detecting a slight smile flicker across Adrian's lips toward his date, a subtext she read as both triumph and vulnerability, forcing her to decide whether to remain silent or signal that she knew more than she let on, setting up the next step in her strategic, silent reclamation of power. Chloe Sinclair dropped her gaze to the marble floor, the echo of her chair scraping still lingering as she realized Adrian had noticed her deliberate glance and now raised an eyebrow, a subtle acknowledgement that shifted the tension in the room. Her phone buzzed quietly, and she saw a text from an unknown number. "I saw what happened." She instinctively assumed it was someone confirming her suspicions about Adrian's intent, reinforcing her belief that he had been scheming to draw her out, and she felt compelled to act immediately. The woman beside Adrian adjusted her clutch, the metallic clasp catching the low chandelier light, and Chloe read it as a subtle code, proof that her interpretation of Adrian's plan was correct, that he was hiding something significant. She stood slowly, letting the fabric of her skirt whisper against the polished floor, each step deliberate, positioning herself to intercept the line of sight between Adrian and his date. The waiter's tray tilted slightly, spilling a few olives onto the dark tile, and Chloe crouched slightly to pick them up, the motion drawing Adrian's attention again and giving her a fleeting advantage to observe his micro-expressions. She imagined that the new text and the accidental spill were part of a coordinated pattern, and her mind raced to anticipate his next move, believing fully that exposing him now would tilt the power toward her. Adrian leaned back, lifting his glass, and Chloe interpreted the pause as hesitation, a crack in his composure, which she decided to exploit. She tapped her fingers lightly on the table, sending a rhythmic signal of alertness, and in the corner of her eye saw the reflection of a camera lens from a decoration behind Adrian, flickering briefly, which she took as confirmation that someone was watching, perhaps complicit in her assumption. She rose fully, moving closer to the edge of her table, brushing the sleeve of her blazer against the polished surface, the friction creating a small scratch that made her heart pound as if time had slowed. Adrian's laugh was sharp, directed at something she could not see, and she interpreted it as mockery aimed at her, deciding she needed to intervene immediately to assert control. Chloe's hand hovered over her phone, debating whether to send a text back or confront verbally, the moment thick with risk, and she finally sent a brief, ambiguous reply, testing the reaction. Adrian shifted, noticing her action, his eyes flickering with a fraction of surprise, and Chloe believed she had forced him into a defensive stance, a power shift confirming her assumptions. The sound of silverware clinking on plates from the neighboring table drew attention, and Chloe instinctively leaned in, listening for any revealing dialogue, her heart hammering as she pieced together the scene from scattered cues. Suddenly, a napkin slipped from her neighbor's lap, fluttering near Adrian's chair, causing him to startle slightly, a reaction that Chloe misinterpreted as guilt, reinforcing her conviction that he was hiding the truth. She inhaled sharply, letting her hand hover near the edge of the table, fingers brushing against the cool surface, preparing to move closer to provoke a response, and at that precise moment, the restaurant saxophone riff swelled, masking the subtle shuffle of her approach. A flash of movement caught her eye, Adrian adjusting his cufflink with an almost imperceptible twitch, and Chloe interpreted this as a sign of weakness, deciding that she needed to step forward and confront him, not yet realizing that her assumptions might be flawed. As she inched closer, balancing the desire to reveal what she thought she knew against the risk of exposure, the waiter's cart rolled by, clattering lightly and drawing a gasp from a child at a nearby table, snapping Chloe's focus back to the immediate surroundings. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and prepared to speak, knowing that the next action could escalate the tension, her body tensing, poised for a confrontation that might not yield the clarity she expected, leaving her at the precipice of the next decisive moment. Chloe Sinclair whispered under her breath, "Not now," as the restaurant door swung open with a gust of chilly April air, and a tall figure entered, catching the warm light and immediately drawing her attention. The unexpected presence of Julian Hawthorne, the CEO she had only met in a workshop weeks ago, sent a ripple through the tense scene. His tailored navy suit and crisp white shirt reflected the chandelier light, drawing a stark contrast against the soft amber of the bistro. Chloe's fingers clenched the edge of her table, the polished wood cold beneath her touch, and she noticed Adrian's gaze shift, confusion flickering across his face as he saw Julian pause at the entrance. The waiter accidentally knocked over a silver salt shaker. The clatter magnified in the sudden hush that fell, and Chloe interpreted every minor movement as signaling a change in the power dynamic. She picked up her phone, seeing a message from Julian, "Table 7, and assumed it was a coordinated move, a sign that she was not alone in this observation, her mind racing to leverage the situation. Adrian shifted uncomfortably in his chair, adjusting his tie, and Chloe detected the micro-adjustment, reading it as defensiveness, believing that Julian's arrival had already begun to unbalance him. The woman across from Adrian laughed too loudly, a sound that cut sharply through the tension, and Chloe sipped her water slowly, the cool liquid anchoring her decision to act. Julian's eyes met hers briefly across the room, a subtle nod that she interpreted as a confirmation of alliance, reinforcing her belief that she could confront Adrian without immediate risk, yet uncertainty lingered. Chloe rose, her heels clicking against the marble floor, moving toward the edge of the seating area, while Adrian's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again, his pause loaded with unspoken conflict. A waiter brushed past, the tray jingling, and Chloe caught the reflection of her own figure in a polished window behind Adrian, reinforcing her presence in the space and intensifying the stakes. Julian stepped closer to his designated table, and Chloe caught the subtle tilt of his head toward her, signaling awareness and readiness, the detail sharpening her confidence and urgency. She adjusted her posture, leaning slightly forward, letting her hand rest on the back of a nearby chair for support, and noticed Adrian's eyes flick to her wristwatch, a small but telling sign of distraction. Chloe's mind raced, connecting the text message, Julian's timing, and the reflections as proof of a coordinated maneuver she believed confirmed her assumptions about Adrian's intentions. As she moved, the chair scraped behind her, drawing a startled glance from the nearby diners, and Adrian leaned back instinctively, a flicker of vulnerability she read as a weakening of his control. She stopped just short of the main aisle, letting the space between them hum with tension, Julian stepping discreetly into a line of sight that could catch any sudden moves from Adrian. The jazz saxophone swelled unexpectedly, masking the subtle shuffle of feet and giving Chloe a moment to reassess, and a napkin from a nearby table floated across the floor, startling her slightly and causing a quick reflexive glance at Adrian, reinforcing her sense of immediacy and danger. Her hand hovered above her purse, fingers brushing the zipper, deciding whether to retrieve her phone or continue advancing. the ambient light glinting off the polished wood and casting small shadows that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Suddenly, Adrian rose slightly from his chair, his drink shaking in his hand, and Chloe interpreted it as panic, a sign that her assumptions were correct, compelling her to step further, each movement measured to assert dominance in the unfolding scene. The door behind Julian clicked shut, the slight echo reverberating across the floor, and Chloe caught a brief glimpse of the doorman watching the interaction with raised eyebrows, a minor but significant detail she filed away as potential leverage. She exhaled slowly, adjusting her skirt and smoothing the fabric with deliberate care, her motion crisp, signaling controlled intent, even as the scenario twisted into unexpected territory with Julian now in the room, and the subtle shift of power forcing her to decide how to proceed, leaving the entire situation poised on the edge of escalation and unresolved tension. Chloe Sinclair adjusted the strap of her purse, the subtle scrape against the marble floor echoing louder than expected, and she noticed Julian's shadow fall across the polished surface, confirming his movement closer, which tightened the room's tension. Her eyes flicked to Adrian's hand as he lifted his wine glass, the liquid catching the chandelier light, creating a small glint that Chloe misinterpreted as a signal exchanged with his date, reinforcing her belief that he was plotting against her and demanding immediate response. She leaned slightly forward, fingers brushing the edge of the table, and picked up a folded napkin, unfolding it methodically to read the receipt printed on the bottom. The itemized totals suggested he had spent significantly more than expected, which Chloe assumed meant he was planning a larger social maneuver she needed to disrupt. The faint sound of silverware clinking behind her drew her attention to a nearby table, and Chloe noticed the reflection of a smartphone screen in the window, flashing a name she did not recognize, further feeding her assumption that there were outside observers colluding with Adrian. She tapped her fingers on the polished table, then decided to stand, stepping carefully between the tables, heels clicking sharply, and the movement caused Adrian's date to glance toward her, her subtle frown confirming Chloe's impression that Adrian's plan might be unraveling. A waiter's cart rattled as it passed, and the sudden jolt caused a wine glass to tip slightly, the liquid sloshing but not spilling, and Chloe interpreted this minor disruption as another clue that the scene was more precarious than she initially believed. She moved closer, tilting her head to catch Adrian's gaze, and his brief hesitation reinforced her assumption that he had underestimated her attention and control. Chloe's hand hovered over her phone, but instead of sending a message, she adjusted the napkin on the table, aligning it with the edge, her deliberate action forcing Adrian to shift in his chair, a minor power shift signaling her readiness. Julian's subtle step toward the center aisle cast a long shadow over the floor, and Chloe interpreted the gesture as an alliance, a reinforcement of her perceived leverage, while Adrian's micro-expression suggested vulnerability that she could exploit. She reached for her glass, swirling the water deliberately, letting the movement create a reflection that caught Adrian's eyes, a silent challenge, and in that moment, she glimpsed a flash of text on his phone as he adjusted it on his lap, revealing a name she did not recognize. Chloe assumed it was further evidence of collusion, heightening her sense of urgency. The soft saxophone riff rose again, masking the subtle shuffle of her feet, and she shifted closer, noticing the glint of light on Julian's cufflink, an unfamiliar pattern she took as confirmation that her assessment of the room's alliances was correct. Chloe inhaled sharply, the scent of coffee mingling with polished wood, and stepped just enough to cause a slight wobble in the chair behind her, a minor disturbance that drew several eyes, including Adrian's, toward her, heightening the tension and forcing her to decide whether to confront or observe further. She exhaled slowly, hand brushing against the napkin and the phone, calculating the next move, and at that moment, a gust from the open door caused the glass door to chime, startling Adrian briefly, and Chloe realized that the perceived signal she had followed might have been misleading, creating an immediate risk that her next action could escalate unpredictably. Her gaze flicked to Julian, noting a slight nod, a subtle but reassuring cue, and Chloe's decision coalesced. She would step fully into the aisle, making her presence undeniable, but the risk of Adrian reacting defensively was now higher than before, leaving the scenario poised on the edge of confrontation and the next revelation. Chloe Sinclair's breath hitched as she stepped fully into the aisle, the polished marble cool beneath her heels, and the faint jingle of the doorbell from the entrance seemed amplified, sending a ripple through the tense atmosphere. Adrian's eyes flicked toward her, a shadow of unease crossing his face, and Chloe seized the moment to glide past the tables, brushing her hand against the back of a chair, causing a subtle wobble that drew a few glances from nearby diners. She spotted the receipt Julian had slid under his napkin, its edges barely visible, and interpreted it as confirmation that a private meeting had been set, the detail cementing her belief that she needed to act immediately. Her fingers hovered over her phone, poised to send a message, but she decided instead to step closer, allowing her presence to dominate the visual line between Adrian and his date. Julian's reflection in the polished window caught Chloe's eye, the glint of his cufflinks signaling readiness, yet the movement distracted her long enough that Adrian's date noticed and smiled subtly, a micro-expression that made Chloe question if her assumptions were fully correct. The soft scrape of her skirt on the floor drew a sharp intake of breath from Adrian, and he leaned forward slightly, grasping the edge of the table, giving Chloe the perception of a crack in his composure, which she intended to exploit. A waiter's tray tilted briefly as he passed, the metallic clink echoing and drawing attention, and, in that moment, Chloe noticed a folded note half hidden beneath a menu at Adrian's side, which she assumed was proof of further planning against her. She reached out, fingers grazing the paper, and Adrian's eyes darted to her hand, a subtle shift that Chloe misread as fear, prompting her to push further, stepping even closer to impose control. The lighting flickered as the server adjusted a lamp, casting shadows across Chloe's face, and she interpreted the elongated shadows as a dramatic advantage, her pulse quickening with the belief she was about to seize the upper hand. Julian stepped slightly behind her, narrowing the aisle just enough that Chloe could feel a subtle containment of space, using it to her advantage, and she read it as a reinforcement of her perceived dominance in the room. Adrian's glass wobbled as he adjusted it, a minor tremor that Chloe interpreted as weakness, and she decided to speak, voice low. "What is he planning?" The words were directed at no one, but the glance at Julian implied collaboration, and Adrian's startled frown suggested a crack in his armor, though quickly he masked it with a forced sip of wine. Chloe felt the opportunity to press further, stepping closer, but the sound of a chair scraping loudly behind her made her pause, momentarily breaking the rhythm of her advance, and she realized the movement could expose her too early, forcing her to retreat slightly. She adjusted her posture, pressing the palm of her hand against the table edge to steady herself, and her eyes caught the shimmer of a reflection in the polished silverware on Adrian's table, revealing a tiny fold of paper she had not noticed, shifting the scenario unexpectedly and creating a new, urgent question in her mind. Her pulse quickened, the saxophone in the background rising in volume, and Chloe recognized that she had committed to the confrontation, but the new fold of paper suggested that the information she thought she had controlled was incomplete, leaving her facing a precarious situation where every action carried irreversible consequences, the stakes elevated and the next move critical. Chloe Sinclair's voice cut through the low murmur. "Wait a minute," and the words hung as a sharp interruption in the warm bistro air, drawing a glance from Adrian and his date. Her hand moved to the edge of the table, gripping the polished wood tightly, the cold surface grounding her as she noticed Julian's reflection in the window shift slightly, revealing a small envelope tucked beneath his napkin, a detail that made her reconsider the timing of her assumptions. The soft chime of the door signaled another guest, and Chloe's eyes caught the flicker of a smartwatch across the room, displaying a name she had not expected, hinting at information that contradicted her previous belief that Adrian was entirely orchestrating events. She stepped closer, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply against the marble, and Adrian's hand trembled as he raised his glass, a micro-signal she interpreted as vulnerability, prompting her to lean in subtly, forcing a micro-confrontation. The waiter's tray scraped against the floor, producing a sharp metallic sound, and Chloe seized the moment to glance at the folded envelope, realizing the contents could shift the power she had been attempting to claim. She pulled the envelope gently from beneath the napkin, the crinkle of the paper loud in the sudden silence, revealing a note that referenced a meeting she had not anticipated, undermining the certainty she had built from prior observations. Chloe's pulse quickened as she adjusted her posture, pressing one hand against the table for leverage while scanning Adrian's face, noticing his subtle shift in eye contact that suggested he might have been unaware of her direct line of observation, a realization that blurred the clarity of her prior assumptions. She tapped the envelope lightly on the table, letting it produce a small echo that drew Adrian's gaze more directly, and in that moment, a spill from the wine glass beside him caused a soft splash, forcing him to react and momentarily giving Chloe control of the visual space. Her fingers hovered over her purse, debating whether to send a rapid message or continue observing, and she chose to step slightly toward Julian, letting his presence reinforce the uncertainty in Adrian's stance. A flash of movement at a neighboring table, a dropped menu momentarily distracted Chloe, but the reflection in the polished silverware revealed the envelope's second note, partially folded, indicating a change in the previously assumed alliance, forcing her to reconsider her next move. Chloe's hand brushed the table again, nudging the envelope slightly toward her, and Adrian's micro-expression flickered with confusion, creating a subtle power shift as she adjusted her stance to dominate the space between them. The soft saxophone swelled, and a light flicker from the chandelier illuminated a small smudge on the floor near her path, catching her attention and reinforcing the feeling that every minor detail now held significance. She exhaled and stepped decisively, nudging the envelope toward Julian as she passed, forcing Adrian to raise his head fully, revealing a hint of panic that Chloe interpreted as a crack in his composure. The sudden movement drew glances from other diners, heightening stakes and visibility, and she noticed a small key glint at Julian's wrist, previously unnoticed, suggesting another layer of access or authority she had not accounted for. Chloe's decision to advance had created both leverage and exposure, a complex balance, and as she reached the edge of the aisle, Adrian's abrupt shift in position caused her to stumble slightly, creating a moment of instability that threatened to unravel her plan, leaving her poised on the precipice of the next revelation, uncertain of the full implications but aware that the unfolding truth was far more intricate than her prior assumptions. Chloe Sinclair's heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she stepped toward Julian, the sound slicing through the low hum of conversation, and she whispered, "We need to end this now," letting her gaze lock on Adrian's, who stiffened instantly. The envelope in her hand rustled as she set it deliberately on the polished table, its edge catching the chandelier light and revealing part of the contents to both men, a subtle power move that shifted the attention. Julian leaned slightly forward, hand resting lightly on the back of Chloe's chair, his presence calm but assertive, a silent reinforcement of her authority without overshadowing her, and Chloe interpreted the gesture as both support and validation, prompting her to lift her chin. Adrian's eyes darted to the envelope, then back to Chloe, confusion tightening his jaw, and a soft laugh escaped his lips, the sound thin, almost brittle, revealing cracks in his composure. She opened the envelope slowly, letting the paper unfold with a crisp snap, and caught a glimpse of a reservation receipt in a private room she had not anticipated, realizing that some of Adrian's prior maneuvering had been legitimate and not fully manipulative, forcing her to adjust her assumptions mid-action. Julian's cufflink glinted as he shifted slightly, the light catching in a way that emphasized the deliberate calm of his posture, contrasting Adrian's jittery gestures, reinforcing the subtle redistribution of control in the room. Chloe's hand hovered above the envelope again, then she set it flat, leaning slightly forward, and Adrian's date brushed a strand of hair from her face, giving a small, imperceptible nod to Adrian, which Chloe interpreted as further alignment against her but quickly dismissed as misdirection. The saxophone swelled as the ambient lighting flickered briefly, the shadows elongating across the table, and Chloe moved to intercept Adrian's line of sight, tapping the edge of her water glass, producing a small, deliberate clink that caused his eyes to jerk toward her, a micro-assertion of dominance. She stepped fully into the aisle, heels against the marble, and noticed the small envelope under Julian's napkin, which contained a partially visible note, hinting at a prior arrangement between him and Chloe that she had not fully understood, creating a momentary shift in perception. Adrian leaned forward, voice low, "Chloe, wait," and she ignored him, letting the motion of her hands over the envelope and her slow, deliberate stride convey control, while Julian's quiet adjustment beside her reinforced her composure. A sudden tinkle from the serving cart drew all eyes briefly, and Chloe caught the reflection of a keycard clipped to Julian's jacket, a subtle indication of access she had not accounted for, introducing new stakes as she realized her next step could backfire if she misjudged the timing. She exhaled sharply, fingertips brushing the edge of the envelope once more, and Adrian's sudden shift in posture, grasping his glass tightly, signaled his rising panic, creating a tangible power shift. Chloe chose to push the envelope slightly toward Julian, a deliberate act that forced Adrian to react immediately, his gaze flicking sharply from the paper to her, tension coiling in the space between them. The chandelier overhead caught the movement, scattering light across the table, and Chloe noted the subtle reflection of her own figure in the window, reminding her of visibility and consequence, her pulse quickening. Julian's calm presence remained constant, but the proximity forced Chloe to decide her next move under pressure, knowing the slightest misstep could expose her hand. As she leaned forward, the soft scrape of the chair echoed, and a napkin fluttered to the floor near Adrian, startling him visibly, a small shock that disrupted his composure and left Chloe poised on the edge of an irreversible confrontation with a new, unseen variable waiting to reveal itself. Chloe Sinclair stepped forward, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, placing the envelope deliberately in front of Adrian, who froze mid-motion, his glass tilting slightly as the amber wine caught the chandelier light. She leveled her gaze, voice low. "It ends here." And the words held the weight of finality. Julian's hand rested lightly on the back of her chair, a subtle anchor of calm authority that reinforced Chloe's composure without overshadowing her, his reflection glinting in the polished window behind Adrian. Adrian's lips parted as if to argue, then closed, a micro-expression of surprise and unease crossing his face as he noticed the note partially revealed, the text on the paper clarifying that some of his prior assumptions about her intentions had been visible all along. Chloe leaned slightly forward, the silk of her skirt brushing the polished floor, and she caught a reflection of the envelope in the silverware, hinting at a hidden signature that shifted the context of her previous deductions. She tapped the envelope softly, producing a crisp sound, and Adrian flinched, his posture tightening as the ambient jazz riff rose in the background, heightening the tension. Julian adjusted his cufflink, the subtle motion casting a glint that caught Chloe's eye and provided an unexpected point of leverage, reinforcing the quiet power balance she now commanded. Chloe's fingers brushed the edge of the chair as she pivoted slightly, closing a subtle gap, forcing Adrian to straighten, the shift of body language creating a silent confrontation that conveyed authority without a single raised voice. The soft scrape of the chair behind her drew a brief pause in her advance, and she noticed a small folded card under the table, a reservation confirmation that hinted at Julian's prior knowledge, introducing a new dimension to the stakes. She exhaled, placing her hand on the envelope with deliberate precision, drawing Adrian's attention fully, and his subtle shift back in his seat confirmed that he understood the game had changed. The chandelier light reflected across Chloe's eyes, catching the depth of her stare, while the clink of a water glass on the table beside Julian punctuated the moment, signaling a minor but meaningful alignment. Chloe lifted the envelope slightly, forcing Adrian to readjust, and Julian's presence, calm and commanding, created a visible redistribution of power, emphasizing Chloe's choice to step forward as the decisive actor. Adrian's gaze faltered briefly, the corners of his mouth tightening, and Chloe interpreted the minor twitch as acknowledgement that her strategy had succeeded, however precariously. She placed the envelope flat again, straightening her posture fully, and the ambient light reflected across her hair, accentuating the sharp elegance of her stance. A small draft from the entrance caused the napkin on the neighboring table to flutter, Adrian's eyes flicking to it, and Chloe recognized the subtle reminder of unpredictability in the room, heightening awareness of consequences for each action. The reflective surface of the polished marble beneath her heels cast light across Julian's polished shoes, signaling quiet assurance, while Chloe stepped back slightly, letting space speak for her authority, the final microshift asserting her control without verbal declaration. She exhaled slowly, eyes sweeping the room, and in the final glint of the chandelier, noticed a small fold of paper tucked behind Adrian's glass, suggesting that not all had been revealed, leaving a lingering question and the cinematic echo of power reclaimed, poised on the threshold of resolution but still rich with unresolved intrigue.